friends. Today's video walks us through the creation of a birthday card for my dog's breeder. I have a golden retriever and we're getting a new puppy. We went to go look at puppies today and the breeder's birthday just happened to be this week. And I thought this was just the absolutely perfect stamp to create a birthday card for her. The birthday card was created on watercolor paper, and the background papers used were from the Spice Market collection from Recollections at Michael's. I like this paper because you get a bunch of different colors and it's fairly lightweight, which is important when creating cards where you have to put them in the mail and you don't want to have a big bulky card with all the different layers that you had together. So I started out cutting a piece of the red cardstock at 5.5 by 4.25, and then this green cardstock was cut a 1/4 inch smaller to accommodate for 1/8 of an inch overlap. I then took the Strathmore Practice watercolor paper and cut that down to 4 inches by 5 inches to use for the stamping the watercolor. I did stamp using Stampin' Up! Ink. I believe that was Crumb Cake, and I wanted to have an ink that would not actually dissolve with the watercoloring, unlike some no-line watercoloring. Here you can see I'm adding the green onto the red base. This is where things go a little bit awry because I didn't get it centered completely and the tape was sticking so bad that I just couldn't peel it up without ripping everything apart. So I had to start over for this step. Thankfully, I had the extra little pieces and was able to use those from the other half of where I cut the sheet apart to use for the base on the second go around. The second go around, I did make sure that I checked very carefully and aligned all the edges before I stuck the tape down. The stamp is a Northwood Stamp Company stamp that I got. And I'll have the details for the stamp number as well as the rest of the supplies in my blog post with the link to the blog post below. This time around, a little bit more careful in laying that down and we have beautiful margins all around. And before I got stamping, just wanted to make sure that the watercolor cardstock fit appropriately on the new green version. Here I'm trying to figure out where to do the stamping. I'm a little bit cautious when I do my stamping to make sure that I align things because this is a woodblock stamp and I'm not able to use my MISTI. I wanted to make sure I knew exactly where to put that bottom edge before I started stamping. Wanted to make sure that I also stamped off, so I got a piece of scrap paper. You may have noticed that that is the paper prompts for this month's version of Mission Inspiration, but I thought it would look cute with some golden retrievers on the back since you'll never see the back of it. It also provided a very good guide for doing the watercoloring later on so that I knew exactly what I was looking at, especially once I started to add the eyes back in. With that bottom edge aligned, it's perfectly centered and perfectly positioned right on the cardstock. I know some people will actually cut the cardstock afterwards. My brain just doesn't work that way, so I take extra care to make sure that I get the stamping in exactly the spot that I want. So from here, I've decided to do this coloring for this card using my Zig Clean Color markers. And I picked out a variety of golden retriever colored browns and golds and rust, as well as the green for the grass. And I also added some hot pink. There are little flowers in the grass, so I added a hot pink to that and a lighter pink color for the dog's tongue. I'll put those also in the supply list. I didn't have an appropriate red for the wagon, so I actually got one of my Tim Holtz distress markers for the wagon, and that was from Fired Brick. That was a much better color for that. So now I'll have you listen to some color music while I do the coloring. Okay, I'm back. Here I'm adding the eyes back in using a black marker. You can see a lot of the lines in the rest of the stamping, however the eyes just really needed to stand out. This was really tricky, especially in the little tiny puppies, because they had such expressive eyes that it was hard to duplicate that with the clean color brush marker. Dried it off a little bit just to make sure that all of the water was absorbed in. While I was coloring, I had some challenges with this watercolor paper, and I'm going to do a review of different levels of quality of watercolor papers just to understand which ones work best with which watercolor mediums. Put some tape on the back and put the watercolor, the picture part, onto the green and red base, and here I'm building the rest of the card. So the card base that the greeting is going to get stamped onto the inside of. I used my MISTI for this, and I used a Stampendous stamp set for the birthday greeting on the inside. I wanted to leave the outside plain just in case she wanted to use the card, in a frame or a picture or something. I didn't want to have a happy birthday on the outside. It was such a cute picture. There really wasn't room for a greeting on the outside anyway. I take a lot of time when I figure out where exactly to position my phrase on the inside, and I do take a lot of care to make sure that the stamp is lined up perfectly with um, both top to bottom, side to side, as well as level within. And my little T-square does a great job of that until, of course, I move the stamp out of the way, picking up the T-square. That's the great thing about the MISTI, is that once you get it positioned, especially with the grid lines, you can see exactly where it's going to go. For the stamping, I used some clear embossing powder and black VersaFine ink. I just absolutely love the black VersaFine ink. It does such a great job with staying wet enough long enough to do embossing. I always like to use clear embossing powder over a colored ink. And sometimes if it's a dye ink that I'm using, I'll do the dye ink and then I'll actually use uh, clear ink on top of it in order to do the embossing. So that way you get the color. And the color comes from the ink and not embossing powder. I haven't had really good luck with colored embossing powders, so I just prefer to use clear embossing powder over colored words. The rest of the VersaFine inks do a great job as well. So if like the purple ink that I use on other projects, that I will frequently use just on its own, rather than trying to cover it with the Versamark ink. Now I wanted to make sure, extra double carefully sure, that I adhered the outside of the card to the right spot on the card base. I have done that before where I've put it on upside down and have had challenges with that in the past. So before I did that, I did want to make sure that I got the fold mark in, because it would be a little bit harder to put that fold line in after I had the decorative outer part adhered to it. I do like using the MISTI to put the decorative piece on top of the card base, because that way you know for sure it aligns perfectly. Okay, all that's left now is to make sure that the front is firmly adhered to the card base, and to find my bone folder to make sure that the crease is nice and crisp. This was a fun card to make, and went very quickly. It only took about a half hour. And even better, she absolutely loved it. So here's some pictures of the card, and thanks for watching. Enjoy.